Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back. We are now on the 10th and the last lecture of this course on international relations, and I hope that on this journey that we've made, we have covered several areas and terrains which have allowed us to look at IR in multiple ways. So in our first lecture, we looked at trying to define what the international is. We looked at the setting up of the first academic departments in IR in Wales and the London School of Economics at the end of the First World War. We have been through 5 theories, and each one of them is rich and filled with a certain perspective about how to examine the international. It also draws attention to our own location, and that is what the theories of feminism, Marxism and critical theory do. Liberalism and realism allow us to see things from the dominant point of view, which is the present economic hegemon, that is the USA. And this journey has been extremely rich in, especially in the last 2 lectures, where we've looked at international organizations and we've looked at globalization. So these last 3 lectures are married to each other in its design, because each of these feed into each other. From 1919 till 2019, IOs have multiplied. They exist at almost every realm, whether it's the environment, nuclear weapons, submarine ecosystems, the climate, and what we can see is that there is now a new sense of what is global governance. 100 years ago, the only actor on the international platform was the nation, the state. 100 years later, there is a new form of sovereignty, and this new form of sovereignty works around regulatory agreements on trade, on finance, on markets, on goods, on technology. And Shais and Shais, in their book The New Sovereignty, argue that this new form of sovereignty is one where the state engages, negotiates and tiptoes around regulatory frameworks. So when we looked at international organizations, we saw that IOs, there are a few IOs which also are greater than the member states themselves. The 2 examples being the International Criminal Tribunal, and then you have the dispute settlement body of the WTO, and both of these operate at the structural level. That means they can order states to do things without and states have to comply to their orders. So there is a new sense of compliance, and compliance means adhering to norms and rules which have been set down. And in effect, if there is one creature which has made a long journey from the time it evolved in the 16th century to now, is that of, and the state essentially is a site of, so the state is what now draws our attention, and in today's lecture I am going to be taking you through to the formation of the state, and we are looking at its new avatar as we see it today, as a state which is negotiating with multinational corporations, with organizations like the World Trade Organization, and fundamentally the core definition of a state is now being called into question, and we will examine that in its brief history. But before we get to the state, we must first examine what a nation is, and that's what we're going to do. So a nation state, the foundations of a state often lie, not always, often lie in a nation, and the conceptualization of a nation or a natio, which is related to the word nascent or nativity, what you are born into, is an indicator of how people have always viewed themselves as us versus them. Communities, tribes, kinships, groups of people have always tended to define themselves as with a commonality against an imagined or a real opposite or somebody else. So when we look at the emergence of the state system, it is useful to look at a corollary of the nation and the idea that there is something which binds all of us together and which makes us different from other people has been central to the human understanding. For instance, Plato and other Greeks called the Greeks the Hellenes, and whereas everybody else who did not speak Greek were called Barbados, and from there the word barbarian stems from somebody who is not as sophisticated, and you also see it in the Hindi word barbar. So in a sense, the distinction between us and them is fundamental to human definition, and one sees it across time, across religion, across epochs, and it has fed into the making of the modern state. So when we look into the making of the modern state, we rely upon scholars such as David Held, Anthony Giddens, who provide us with narratives of how the state emerged. Charles Tilly, for instance, the historian, who is known for the wide breadth that the wide span of his works over hundreds of years to see the emergence of an institution. So in our discussion of the nation, what we're trying to dwell upon is the idea that communities have traditionally bonded together and identified people who are not like them, and at the same time we're trying to find our way to looking into the roots of a state. What was the earliest state, what is the definition of a state, and how is it that we have come to a point where the principal actors in international politics as well as the domestic sphere is the state. If people were always banding themselves in groups, the empires were far more common through these centuries than states. So empires are by definition large areas of territory controlled by force and domination. But interestingly, empires often have fuzzy borders and have a multi-ethnic people living within them. So when you look at the Roman Empire, when you look at the Ottoman Empire, when you look at the British Empire, by principle there is a distinction made of the people who belong and the people who don't belong, citizens and subjects, and again to return to Plato's people who are Greek and people who are barbaric. So empires must be imagined as large, contiguous territories controlled by a center, by authority and domination. Outposts were governed by governors, but essentially empires did not have two fundamental features of the state, and that is finite and clearly defined borders and a population which is homogeneous and classified as a population. So the earliest mullings and ponderings and theorizing on the state and on the nature of the state is during this period. We come to the 16th century, and we see that it is around this time that theoreticians, a mathematician by the name of Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher by the name of John Locke, and a writer, a philosopher by the name of Rousseau are mulling over the nature of a state. What is the state? And it is here that notions of sovereignty clearly emerge. Sovereignty as the absolute power of the head of the state within its boundaries, over a population, with a monopoly of violence and resources, is the image which emerges at this time. And of course, it is being accompanied by historical changes. So within Europe between 1618 and 1648 is the 30 Years' War, which ends with the Treaty of Westphalia, and within Western academia, Westphalia has been upheld as the triumph of, not the triumph, but as the completion of the modern state, as a state with clearly defined boundaries, a population and a monopoly over violence, and that is the birth of the absolute state. But again, it is the features that we are looking at are sovereignty, and the definition of sovereignty would be the complete power within that space of the head of the state, usually a monarch. And with Westphalia comes this idea that within a certain area there is a identifiable source of power, and that is the head of the state. We see that there is a corollary of this thinking within the theories and philosophical writings of the social contractualists, and therefore it is here that there emerges a strong petition, a strong argument for the individual. So even though Westphalia marks the coming of the absolute state, it is also at this time that there is a fervent recognition of the need of to protect the rights of the individual, and it is here that Hobbes is truly striking. Hobbes is a remarkable figure who conducted scientific experiments, who was a mathematician, but who also wrote a foremost treatise on politics called the Leviathan. And the Leviathan is a very interesting piece of work. Now, why do we stop at Hobbes? Hobbes' theory of the state is a foremost recognition of the authority of the state, and let's just pause and look at the term and the word Leviathan itself. The word Leviathan comes from the Bible, and it refers to a sea monster, and in Hobbes' depiction of the state as a monster, as something which is monstrous, refers to the fact that the state is so powerful and not human, that it cannot be expected to be humane. But that's not the only aspect of Hobbes which is interesting. Hobbes is often seen as a champion of liberal rights, and it is here that he uses the ploy of the social contract. And the social contract is that agreement, that imaginary agreement made between men and the state in admission of the state being created by the contract. So the state is a byproduct of the contract, and when Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau are referring to the contract, of course they are trying to break away from the divine right to rule, where the right to rule was seen as a mandate of divinity, and in the idea that the state is man-made specifically because there were no women involved in either its imagination or its execution. The state is an artificial being which conducts warfare, has a foreign policy, runs a good government, but ostensibly for the welfare of its citizens. So Hobbes' theory is contextualized at a time when kings and queens felt that they could rule with impunity, and Hobbes' intervention is a classic example of how the individual, the citizen, is shapes the state as much as the state shapes the citizen, and there is a balance. The citizen has a right to his privacy, to her privacy. There is a private sphere and there is a public sphere, and we see these ideas crystallizing in the economic writings of Adam Smith, of Ricardo, in the political writings of John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and there is this idea that even though the state is powerful, it must not strangle or suffocate its citizens, and there is a sphere within which the state cannot reach. So in effect, the 16th century is a fascinating period where one can see as to how certain ideas are crystallizing with the birth of the modern state and clearly identifiable boundaries. There is the emergence of also the citizen, a person who has a stake to play in the state. It is also a period of time when liberalism is flourishing. It is a time when the East India Company is set up as the world's first private corporation, which it is at part times it is a trading corporation, at times it is a mercenary company. But this is a period where both the individual and the state, their roles are being evaluated, assessed and redefined. But we do not speak of nationalism yet. It is in the 18th century that we see how these two ideas of a nation and a state fuse together in the culmination of two historic nations, and that would be the states of Italy and Germany, rather Germany and Italy, because Germany was formed in 1871 and 2 decades later it would be the state of Italy. Now, what we have been doing so far is that we have looked at nation as an idea of us versus them, which has existed in every period, in every community of human civilization. And we have also seen as to how there emerges an artificial body called the modern state. And we call it the modern state because uh, it has broken away, it has severed its links from the medieval period of superstition and being caged in by the church. So the modern state is modern precisely because it has a forward-looking vision. It has a monopoly over violence. It is sovereign. It is not controlled by forces beyond its boundaries, such as the church. So, because we are looking at the 16th, 17th, and 18th century in such great detail, it is also important to remember that it is during this period that the state defies the Holy Roman, the Church, the Vatican, which had been for so many centuries controlling monarchies, Catholic monarchies from its base in Italy. So we're going to be looking at points of opposition where states have broken away and redefined themselves, and Westphalia then becomes a reference point to that. So we're looking at three of these states. The first is the state of Great Britain, which during the reign of Henry VIII breaks free of the papal influence, that is the influence of the papacy, the Pope in the Vatican. And of course, divorce was inconceivable within Catholicism, and when Henry VIII divorces his first wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, it creates rumbles because it was unheard of for a king to divorce as his wife, and at the risk of being excommunicated, Henry VIII breaks away from the papal church, and it is here that Protestantism really flourishes in Great Britain. So that's the first example of states seeking their establishing their sovereignty in every form, whether it's Henry VIII and then which goes on by Queen Elizabeth I, who then supports the East India Company. But we see this coming together of passion and territory in the formation of Germany and Italy in the 19th century. So Germany's genesis, the roots of the formation of Germany is often credited to her great statesman Otto von Bismarck. He is often seen as a great diplomat, and before Germany was formed, it was a collection of several districts within Germany, Prussia being one of them, and Prussia was of course the most powerful, and to Bismarck goes the credit of rallying and initiating a war against France, with which they would be able to retrieve two priceless spaces called Alsace and Lorraine, which are very rich in iron. And when Germany defeats France in 1871 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, is when the state of Germany emerges from being pulled together with a common language and a common history, and with the military engineering of her great minister Bismarck. The king at this time is King Wilhelm I, and the celebration of Germany is seen as one of the high points of nationalism, because one sees the clear fusion of territory with people with a common history and a common with a shared memory, and these elements go into making a nation state. So what we see over here is that states were engineered in the truest sense of the word by lobbying and manufacturing a belief that people have had a shared memory and history and language, and it's precisely these elements which go in together in the formation of the state of Italy. So Germany and Italy are often seen as the high points of nationalism, nationalism which is wedded to territory, and it is also here that one sees the role of language and memory in the shaping of a national community. So in a sense, the birth of a nation depends upon a commonality. It could be a language, it could be a memory, it could be a belief in everybody being bound together. But most importantly, it has a sense of a imagined community, to use the description by Benedict Anderson about imagination playing a huge role in pulling people together. So what we see are 4 examples of a nation being a group of people with wedded to the idea that they belong and they are marked and different from others. You then have the example of Great Britain, which has a mixture, which has a there is a heterogeneity to that population, with comprising of Scots, Saxons, Irishmen, and of Irish people, and of course this was again questioned on the basis of nationalism. Scotland and Ireland have argued that they are not part of this artificial construct. And thirdly, you have examples where the nation and territory have fused together in the examples of Germany and Italy. So what you essentially have are several examples of a nation with territory and a nation without territory, a nation with sovereignty and a nation without sovereignty, and there are multiple configurations possible of that. A classic example would be the state of Israel, the Zionist project which fervently worked towards the formation of Israel in 1948, culminated in 1948 territorially, was only possible because there had been a long preserved memory of the Israeli people. So what one sees is that whether it is Kashmir or Palestine, whether it is Bosnia or the Kurds, there is a sense of an ethnic identity, although not always, which guides people to form a nation. A nation can exist with or without a state, and in Italy and Germany we see the perfect marriage between nationalism and territory. And by the early 20th century, what you then have is the emergence of the modern state system, marked by states with clearly defined boundaries as members of this international society. So as Hedley Bull would say, that this is an international society with states as members, while at the start of the 20th century many of these states were imperial states. By the center of the century, there were newly formed decolonized states which had mimicked and accepted that definition of a state. Now of course this has a very lengthy and each decolonization process has been extremely distinct, lengthy. But what one sees is that at the in the middle of the 20th century, one sees that there is a universalization of the modern state with its four elements of a clearly defined boundary, a monopoly over violence, the sovereign state uh, establishing itself as a unquestionable source of power, and the sovereign state then becomes the fundamental unit of the international system. The last 100 years, therefore, have been remarkable in the rapid transformations made from imperialism to decolonization, from colony to state. And the easiest way to see this rapid change would be to look at the map in 1919 and to look at the rapid growth in the number of states in these 100 years. This has by far been the most significant change in the manner in which we understand the global, by the sheer number of states which have multiplied, and each being a sovereign equal member in the eyes of international organizations. So what one sees then is that an idea from Europe has traveled across the world, and as a consequence, the sovereign state is the basic unit of the international system and also enjoys a normative equality. So within the General Assembly of the United Nations or at the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, a state the size of France would exercise the same rights as a state the size of Sri Lanka. And we do know that the number of states has increased to a wide degree, and now the number nearly 190. At the same time, there has also multiplied the number of international organizations which regulate these states in multiple ways, and it is the interaction between these states in a state of globalization in what we call global governance. So when one looks back on the modern state, one is struck by this impersonal, artificial apparatus which is given the charge of regulating human life. So the emergence of the modern state system in the 16th, 17th, 18th century in Europe is a testimony to the belief and faith in an impersonal power regulating our lives, and at the same time also makes the space for the individual within this impersonal space. Now the reason why one talks about impersonal space is because this is a time when monarchism is the order of the day, and it is not till the 1776 American Revolution and the 1789 French Revolution that monarchy as a form of government is rudely and brutally pushed aside in favor of a government formed by the people. So what one sees during this period is the idea that people are appropriating the sovereignty once in the hands of their monarch in themselves, and then these ideas are celebrated as self-evident truths. That is the equality amongst men, and over here it is specifically amongst white men because during this period the slavery trade the trade in slaves hasn't been abolished yet. That comes in the early 19th century, 1823 if I'm not mistaken. And this is a period when men are celebrating the rights of man, as Paine puts it, and this is a period of the heyday of republicanism and civic liberties and the political rights of individuals. Now, why this is important is because this occurrence which took place about 200 years ago was a form of empowerment of the individual, the faith in the Constitution, the civil rights movement in America, the Civil War in America, the French Revolution, the coming of Napoleon, the codification of law in France. All of these were hugely instrumental in bolstering the authority of the state in codification. This is also a time when the state undertakes public welfare measures. So, the setting up of schools, hospitals and jails are part of the formation of the modern state, and the modern state therefore is then a unit within which the power of the state is impersonal, but it regulates our lives from our birth till our death. But it is also a sovereign state in the sense that it does not take orders from anybody else, and a sovereign state by definition is the highest authority is the state itself. Now, why this is important is that when we discuss globalization and when we look at international relations, we see that there is a certain erosion of this sovereignty. So, looking at Jean Baudin, the theorist of sovereignty, who argued that sovereignty, who theorized sovereignty, where sovereignty was seen as that absolute control above which there was no higher power. That idea has come to be chipped away at when we speed up things and we look at the various changes which have taken place in the 21st century. As a consequence of globalization, we now have laws and regulations over every conceivable aspect of international politics. Whether it is the law of the seas, whether it is the International Criminal Tribunal, whether it is the dispute settlement body of the WTO, there are organizations which have shaped and chipped away at the sovereignty of modern states. So, when we are looking at the relationship between the modern state and globalization and the role of globalization in global governance, there are a few points of view which are worthy of being looked into. The first is, of course, the idea that this is the end of the state. Now, that is an argument which has been put forward by champions of globalization. Kenichi Omaha is one of them, who argues that globalization has eroded that sovereign authority over its boundaries, over the bounded nature itself of states has been questioned, and those assumptions that we made about the boundedness of sovereignty has come into question. So, if the first assault on globalization or the first assault on the state has been made by globalization, it is then a force which comes from the outside. It is a force which is regulating behavior, regulating codes of conduct, regulating acquisition, trade, nuclear weapons, and therefore there is a new sense of sovereignty, where sovereignty is not absolute, but sovereignty exists at the scale of cooperation, negotiation, and adhering to and compliance with these international codes. So, whether it is international law or regulatory mechanisms in trade, environment, and other areas of humanitarian justice, human rights, one sees that there is a thick linkages between states and international organizations, states and non-government organizations, and of course the relationship of the state with technology itself. So, in the evaluation of the state today, the first question mark which we can assign to the state itself is its new avatar as a negotiator, if not a driver, but as a participant in international politics. So, that is the first complication in the last 50 years, and we have seen as to how there has been a multiplication in the number of agreements, the areas it has been championed. So, whether it is peace and security, landmines, climate change, clean water, endangered animals, there is a extremely dense codification of regulatory mechanisms across borders, and states therefore now are compelled to comply with these mechanisms. So, that is the first manner in which one can evaluate the state, and therefore scholars like Susan Strange would say that the state is retreating. It is retreating from the territory, it is retreating from its monopoly of violence, because now you have several other legitimate forms of security organizations which are equally legitimized to carry out war in a military fashion. So, when we pause and reflect upon the nature of the state and the state in the 21st century, it is globalization which raises questions about sovereignty, about the relationship between citizens and the state, and about the fundamental commitment of the state to public welfare. As we saw in the previous lecture, under the Washington Consensus, states are pressurized to reduce public expenditure on public welfare projects such as schools and hospitals, which also opens the ground for private players to enter and change the dynamics between the relationship between the citizen and the state. The second assault on the sovereign state has come from within, and over here we look at, again we return to the issue of nationalism and the emergence of secessionist groups which challenge the legitimacy of the modern state over its boundary. So, whether it is Catalonia and Spain, Kashmir in India, there are multiple examples, the Kurds in Iraq, there are multiple examples of nations with a common history, language, culture, championing, fighting for secessionism, or at least a recognition of their rights to self-determination. In many ways, this again reminds us of the bloody history of the formation of states themselves, and as to how the state itself is seen as a logical end to the aspirations of a nation. In the 21st century, the right to self-determination is a quest for a bounded space, a territory, and a state and statehood itself, and several nations in that process, are in that campaign struggle to achieve that. And that also points to us the fact that the state itself is now a celebrated promised land. The promised land now is the achievement of achieving a state, and it is to that end that nations without a state are now, not now, have been struggling for decades to achieve that, which again is a bloody struggle, a hard struggle, a political campaign which isn't easy, but nonetheless tells us that there is a universalization of the idea of the state itself. So when we look at the state in today's times, what we see is that there are forces beyond the state and forces within the state which are questioning its legitimacy. And by legitimacy we mean its right to rule. On what basis do states have a right to govern? And that takes us back to the issue of governance itself. At a time when governance issues are being, decisions are made hundreds of miles away in headquarters of the IMF, of the World Trade Organization, when decisions which impact everyday lives are made not in the nation, not in the state that they belong to, but by organizations beyond it, we can also therefore question the legitimacy of the state itself. If decisions which impact its people are no longer its mandate, then what is the state? We then argue, one can then argue that the state has been hollowed out. The state has been hollowed out of its mandate of public welfare, of its commitments to its people, of sovereignty in itself. And what one then finds is that governance is an intersection between the state, private players, multinational corporations, technology, and all of this comes within the gambit of globalization. So international relations therefore is a rapidly transforming space. It is a space where war and peace itself are being defined, redefined constantly. The last century has been a horrific century of battles and struggles and resistances and protests and triumphs and peace. So the last century is has been a complex and rich period for international relations, and therefore the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, ethnic nationalism, ethnic cleansing, the birth and creation of international organizations, and finally globalization itself have made the world a rich, fascinating, bewildering space where each one of us is constantly trying to make sense of the world that we belong in. Now, in this course of international relations, what this has opened up the ground for us is to take this journey forward and to look at the many debates, discussions around the environment, around economic policies, around the future of the state itself, and therefore invite you to, I urge you to look at IR not just through a theoretical lens, but as a rapidly changing space of growing interlinkages between spaces, between time, between geographies. We know that globalization has rapidly changed the pace and means of migration. But at the same time, it is equally important to pay attention to the great inequalities in our world today. IR would be meaningless if we turn away from the gaps between rich and poor states, between equality and inequality within a state, and the growing momentum which tells us to pay attention to the dispossessed, of children, of the trafficking of women and children, of human rights, of violations of the rights of individuals across the world. And international relations therefore returns to where we started off in 1919, which is with a ethical normative quest of what is the meaning of war and suffering, what is the quality of life, what is the comparable quality of life between a Western, between a first world country and a third world country. As scholars and practitioners and as students, what is that lens, what is that perspective that we utilize when we look at the world outside our window? Are we as realists, or do we look at the power politics and explain it away by arguing that power is constant and interest is defined by power, and that national interest would always be above everything else? Or do we celebrate the Bretton Woods institutions the way liberal institutionalists, liberal scholars such as Keohane and Nair do? This is truly the age of neoliberalism, and we can see that as we look at the progress made by the World Trade Organization in terms of education, in services, in migration. Or do we, like the Marxists, like the Frankfurt School, like Robert Cox, do we then look at the world that we inhabit and see the source, the mode of production, and the nature of the relationship between the worker and the produced? The fourth perspective that we've seen is that of feminism. As I mentioned, the most influential decisions which regulate our lives when it comes to education, health, infrastructure, are now being taken by nameless bureaucrats hundreds of miles away, predominantly men. So the questions that we then need to ask are, what are the global inequalities upon which IR is premised? Is there a scope for emancipation, or there isn't? And in this course, we have looked at the multiple perspectives of IR, and most crucially, we have looked at the growth of international organizations. We have looked at the meaning of globalization, and eventually we have stopped at looking at the nation state itself. As we end our course, what I urge you to reflect upon is the relationship between the individual and the state. As technology becomes more pervasive and incisive and influential, we find that there are forces beyond our national borders that influence us, and therefore as citizens, it is foremost upon us as students of IR to ask the question about the relationship between the state, the power and the system, and that is fundamentally those three layers upon which IR is built. So I end this course by asking a few questions about our location in to knowledge, our location within international relations, our location within international politics. How does one assess a state's foreign policy? Is it on the basis of ethics? Is it on the basis of realpolitics? The mandate of IR, of course, has changed dramatically from a time when it looked on the outside. Neoliberal policies have compelled us to look on the inside. What is the impact of globalization on the inside? And one can summarize and say that those distinctions between outside and inside have truly collapsed to a point that globalization is fundamentally about individuals against global forces. And with that we end this course. I hope that it has been an enjoyable journey and an insightful journey, and the road ahead is of course equally rich and inviting. There are several avenues to look up in IR, whether it is international law, humanitarian law, international organizations such as the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, foreign policies, gender issues within migration, and of course the most crucial issues of labor and production. So with that I end this course, and thank you very much for being here with me. Thank you.